Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Michael Ettlinger. I direct the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, and thank you all for joining us for the final event in our Confronting the Racial Wealth Gap lecture series for this year. These lectures and discussions have brought together students and faculty, as well as members of the wider community, as part of the increased dialogue on issues of racial injustice here at UNH, and we are hoping to continue the series with additional events next year. The series is sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts through the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship Project, the Paul College of Business and Economics, and the Carsey School of Public Policy. Big shout out to and thank you to the faculty who've been instrumental in organizing it, from the Department of History, the Department of Classics, Humanities, and Italian Studies, Department of English, Department of Sociology, and the Department of Management. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll just say, for those of you who have questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can click on that at any time during, from now on, and put your questions in there. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I just finished last night the book that she's going to be discussing today, and it's I learned a lot, and it's really a fascinating book and very readable. I really commend it to you. But the author with us today is Justene Hill Edwards. She's an assistant professor in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She's a scholar of African American history. She specializes in the history of slavery and the history of capitalism in the United States. She received her PhD in history from Princeton University and holds an MA in African New World Studies from Florida International University and a BA in Spanish from Swarthmore College. Her dissertation, Felonious Transactions, the Legal, Culture, and Business Practices of Slave Economies in South Carolina, 1787 to 1860, was a finalist for the C. Van Woodward Prize from the South Historical Association, a finalist for the Scheer Dissertation Prize from the Society for Historians on the Early American Republic, and a finalist for the Herman E. Kroos Dissertation Prize from the Business History Conference. She is the author of the book I mentioned, Unfree Markets, the Slaves Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina. It was published just last month in April by the Columbia University Press. So with that, I will hand it off to our guest.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you for the rest of the team for inviting me to speak with you this evening about my recently published book and really give you a snapshot of the work that I do in the book. And I look forward to what I'm sure will be a fun and interesting conversation about some of the topics that I introduce here. So I'm going to start with an African-American man named Gus Feaster. He was a teenager at the outbreak of the American Civil War. He didn't know where he was born, which meant that he didn't know his exact age. But he also didn't have a clear memory of his childhood in Union, South Carolina. But when the 90-year-old man was interviewed by Caldwell Sims, a field worker with the Federal Writers Project, on June 28, 1937, the one aspect of his youth that he did recall in stunning clarity was of work, specifically his early years enslaved on a South Carolina plantation. He described how he remembered splitting peas as an enslaved child, but Feaster's memories were not relegated to work that his enslaver compelled him to complete. His recollection also included work for which he received compensation, work that we could say he did for himself. Feaster earned money by, as he said, gathering blackberries to sell at Goshen Hill to a lady that made wine from them. Then he did what any young person would do with a bit of money in their pocket and the freedom to buy whatever their heart desired. I bought candy with the money, he revealed. The money that he earned from picking and selling blackberries satisfied not only his sweet tooth, but also his sense of youthful independence. That was the reason he joked that he didn't have any teeth in his old age. So not only did Feaster remember how work shaped his life as an enslaved boy, but he also remembered how his existence as an enslaved child included work for money. So it may appear as though Feaster's experience earning money was out of the ordinary, but it wasn't. The historical record is flush with examples of enslaved people figuring out how to earn wages, buy goods, and accumulate property. In general, they wanted to participate in the economic lives of their communities. Enslaved men and women with not only money, but also the purchasing power of their labor were everywhere. They traded on plantations and in city centers, along riverways, and in ports. Enslaved people brought items that they desired to the marketplace and sold goods to anyone willing to engage economically with them. They also bought goods, they bought commodities that they wanted. They hustled and haggled with travelers on country roads. They negotiated with their enslavers and white employers for money. And they occupied public marketplaces, selling goods and other handmade items such as baskets. They maintained their own gardens and sold their produce to anyone willing to buy them, even their own masters. All of these economic pursuits comprise what historians like myself call the slaves economy. It would be easy to believe that enslaved people's experiences as economic actors can be distilled to their experiences as property, perhaps only as capital investments. After all, enslavers and slave traders viewed them as capital, more specifically movable assets. And enslaved people's labor helped to catapult the American economy into global prominence in the 19th century with the production of cotton. The archival record, though, shows a more complex story. Embedded in the archive emerges the inner workings of enslaved people's economic lives. These records show that enslaved men and women created their own economic culture as a material and an emotional shield against the traumas and really the violence of their enslavement. But just because the slaves economy was ever present does not mean that enslaved people benefited fully from it. For example, did Gus Feaster turn work or hustle, perhaps, of gathering and selling blackberries into something more significant, perhaps earning enough money to buy more autonomy or perhaps his own liberation? The answer is unfortunately no. Though he used the money that he earned to purchase something that he wanted, candy, he could not work enough and really could not earn enough to purchase his own liberation. So this evening, I pose two questions. The first, what happens when we explore the limits of economic and really capitalism in enslaved people's lives? And second, what if enslaved people's investments in capitalist enterprises actually undermine their pursuit of freedom? So in my book on free markets, I propose a radical idea. I argue that there were moments when enslaved people acted as capitalists. They engaged in the types of economic activities that characterized the world of capitalism during the period of legal slavery in America, in particular in the 19th century. They were buyers and sellers of goods, and they attempted to make a profit from their labor. And they sought out the best prices for the goods that they were selling and trying to acquire. But for enslaved people, these types of activities, especially the work that they did to accumulate property for themselves, and really the capitalist enterprises in which they were invested, did not equal for them a measure of freedom. Instead, it kept them connected to the exploitative slave regime that shaped their lives and livelihoods in an overwhelmingly negative way. So moving from the early colonial period in the 1670s to the outbreak of the American Civil War in the 1860s, I show that while enslavers and those invested in the economic success of slavery in South Carolina, while they embraced capitalist enterprises, which helped them build wealth and really secure their economic status, for enslaved people, their investments in capitalism did not equate economic freedom. Instead, it meant a continuation of the violent and exploitative regime that shaped their lives. So the slaves economy began in South Carolina's colonial period, really from the founding of the colony in 1670. And I focus on South Carolina for a variety of reasons. First, because it was founded as the first slaveholding colony in the colonies and then the states that would become the United States. And second, because it was the first state to secede from the Union after Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860. And so enslavers created a colony and then state where they fully supported and fully embraced slavery in every way. And this regime lasted almost 2 centuries. And in many ways, white South Carolinians were in the vanguard of pro-slavery advocates during this long period of time. On the other hand, it was enslaved Africans transported from Barbados and regions of Atlantic Africa who introduced their unique ideas about economic activity to the colony, to really the culture of slavery that began to emerge early in the colonial period. And so all of this is to say that in the colonial period, interestingly enough, enslaved people brought with them their own ideas about how to engage in the economic life of the places where they were enslaved. And the slaves economy was introduced by enslaved people and also embraced by white colonists from the very establishment of the colony. Enslaved people, in addition to working on rice and indigo plantations in the Low Country, also dedicated whatever free time they had to growing food, to consume for themselves, or interestingly enough, to sell to willing consumers, both Black and white. And so let me introduce a slide. Perfect. Okay, so in the 18th century, the slaves economy in South Carolina grew and became a more prominent aspect of life, especially in the port city of Charlestown, also known as Charleston. In particular, enslaved women were at the forefront of economic activity in Charleston. They sold goods that they and their families had cultivated or produced, and it was not uncommon for their enslavers to actually condone these activities. Enslaved women were so prominent in the Charleston marketplace in the 18th century that white residents and visitors commented on their presence, often complaining about the overwhelming influence that they wielded in the marketplace. And this is just an example. This is from the South Carolina Gazette from September 24th, 1772. And this is what it says. I have seen these Negro women surround fruit carts in every street and purchase amongst them the whole contents to the exclusion of every white person. And they are your slaves who fix the exorbitant prices which are given for most of the articles that are bought at the lower market, where scarce any but Black butchers are employed. And so interestingly enough, we see here in this one quote, a visitor really trying to understand how Black women, how enslaved African women could wield so much power, so much influence economically in this marketplace. And so, interestingly enough, this is where the marketplace existed. This is a plan of Charlestown from 1780, and this is where the lower market resided at the convergence of the Ashley and the Cooper rivers. So enslaved African women in colonial era South Carolina were visible in one of the most vibrant and important marketplaces in colonial America. They held a certain amount of autonomy in the Charleston marketplace during the 18th century. And this autonomy afforded them the opportunity to make money for themselves and insert themselves directly in a variety of commodity exchanges. They were at the literal center of commercial life in this colonial port city, and they were not relegated to simply working as enslaved laborers or commodified persons. Instead, they were active economic agents, buying goods, selling wares, negotiating, haggling with customers, Black and white, enslaved and free. They, in some way, challenged the racial and gendered lines that defined other aspects of their lives. And so this continued into the 18th century, even during and through the American Revolution. Enslaved people sold goods such as firewood and food to loyalists and patriot soldiers alike. And they maintained their independent cultivation, all in an effort to survive the unpredictability of war. But in the late 18th century, with the talk of freedom and liberty swirling around them, and with the founding of the nation, enslaved people were encountering dramatic changes to their lives. This change revolved around the introduction of a product that would dramatically transform not only their lives, but the American economy and the institution of slavery writ large. And that product was cotton. The economy of South Carolina in particular was dominated by slave-grown rice in the colonial period. Rice was the largest export product of South Carolina and from the American colonies in the colonial period, making enslavers and rice planters in South Carolina some of the wealthiest in mainland British North America. But after the patenting of the cotton gin in 1793 and the explosion of the cotton industry at the beginning of the 19th century, South Carolina's export economy, and therefore the economy of slavery, began to shift. Okay, so let's go back. Here we go. Okay. There we go. So one traveler to South Carolina in the early 19th century remarked that cotton had become king. The staple commodity of the state is rice, but cotton is now eagerly cultivated, traveler John Davis observed at the end of the 18th century. It is to the crop of cotton, he wrote, that the planter looks for the augmentation of his wealth. What this meant is that short staple cotton quickly eclipsed rice as the dominant export that enslaved men and women in South Carolina cultivated. And this economic shift affected the lives, and in particular, the economic lives of the enslaved. The experiences and words of one enslaved person really shows how the introduction of cotton harvesting technologies changed the nature of slavery and the evolution of the slaves' economy in South Carolina at the beginning of the 19th century. In 1805, one of the greatest fears of enslaved people came true for an African-American man named Charles Ball. So his enslaver sold the 30-year-old man to a slave trader bound for the Carolinas in Georgia, far from his family in Maryland. Ball had funneled into the domestic slave trade during a period, Ball was funneled, into the domestic slave trade during a period of dramatic economic growth in the United States. The introduction of the cotton gin and the rapid expansion that came from the Louisiana Purchase transformed the landscape of slavery in the American South. It upended the lives of thousands of enslaved people, such as Ball. In 1837, Ball published an autobiography entitled Slavery in the United States after his escape to freedom. He wrote that in Maryland, enslaved people took on waged work, mainly at night and on Sundays. Ball wrote, if they chose to fish, they had the privilege of selling whatever they caught. Enslaved people in Maryland might even catch enough fish or oysters to buy coffee, sugar, and other luxuries for their wives, besides keeping themselves and their families in Sunday clothes. So when Ball reached the harrowing journey on foot from Maryland to South Carolina, he noticed that enslaved people were investing much more of their time and energy into earning money in a similar way that they did in Maryland, but slavery in South Carolina differed from Maryland in startling ways. The sheer ubiquity of enslaved laborers dedicating their free time to wage labor absolutely stunned him. Enslaved people in 19th century South Carolina carved out time whenever they could to complete extra work for pay. They were earning wages from the very people who owned them, their enslavers. At other times, they traded with local white merchants and poor whites. Ball even observed that when the slaves go out to work for wages on Sundays, their employers never flog them. The practice of working on Sunday is so universal amongst the slaves on the cotton plantations that the immorality is never spoken of. So Ball was making a connection here between South Carolina's cotton economy and how enslaved people continue to engage in their own economic pursuits, free from punishment or hurdles from their enslavers, interestingly enough. So not only did the omnipresence of the slaves economy absolutely surprise Ball, but the popularity of cotton did so as well. Cotton fields in bloom defined Ball's first impression of South Carolina. He related that little attention was paid to the cultivation of anything else but cotton. He wrote that this plant was almost the sole possessor of the fields. It covered the plantations adjacent to the road as far as I can see, both before and behind me. And as the economy of slavery grew to include cotton as a major export product, so too did enslaved people's networks of trade grow. But in a departure from what Ball experienced in Maryland, enslaved people's economic networks grew out of necessity. So this meant that enslaved people in South Carolina were purchasing a range of goods from sugar and molasses to coffee and rum. They also bought clothing. In the winter, they would oftentimes receive a set of woolen or linen clothing from their enslavers, but these items were of poor quality and rarely lasted the entire year. For this reason, enslaved people that Ball encountered in South Carolina had to use their earnings to buy necessities like clothing, and not Sunday clothing as he described in Maryland, but everyday clothing. And this suggests that slaveholding cotton planters were not providing adequate clothing to their enslaved laborers. Ultimately, enslaved people continued to lack basic necessities, and importantly, this was by enslaver design. They had to spend whatever free time they had to complete extra work to earn money to purchase the most basic of necessities for themselves and their families. And even though Ball focused on the slaves economy during the early 19th century, this trade continued to evolve in the antebellum era. And so it might seem as though enslavers would have been opposed to any activity that would have taken their slaves' attention and labor energy away from cotton production, especially given the vast profits to be made from cotton cultivation. But increasingly, especially beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, as profits increased, enslavers came to realize that they could squeeze more productivity out of their slaves by controlling the one aspect of slaves' economic lives that had been their own, and that was the slaves' economy. This meant that enslavers were increasingly supportive of slaves' economic activities, and not just supportive, but they increasingly forced enslaved people to engage in extra work and to engage in waged work. Enslavers were benefiting, at the end of the day, economically from not having to provide necessities to their slaves. Enslavers' perspectives are reflected in this note from an 1833 agricultural magazine entitled On the Management of Slaves. Let's go back here. Okay, so this is what it says. This is a small snippet from a longer piece about essentially slave management strategies. I never allow my Negroes to sell anything without my express permission. I never restrict them in any acts of industry, but reward them punctually for their exertions by taking from them at a fair price whatever they have justly to offer. If a Negro is suffered to sell anything he chooses without an inquiry being made, a spirit of trafficking is at once created. To carry this on, both means and time are necessary, neither of which is he or right possessed. So the enslaver is essentially saying this. He allowed his enslaved laborers to sell goods that they had cultivated, but only with his permission. And I can talk a little bit about the legal history of this concept in the Q&A, especially in South Carolina, because it is fascinating. And so this enslaver did not want his enslaved people. He didn't want to keep them from engaging in productive pursuits, that is to make money for themselves. But he and he alone was going to decide what was the just price that he would pay. And if he didn't intervene, then his enslaved laborers, he believed, would find other customers for their goods, as enslaved people had been doing in the past. And that could potentially create problems for him. especially creating a spirit of traffic, as he calls it. That's supposedly a negative thing. Overall, this enslaver was concerned about his mastery over his slaves. He wanted to keep them productive, but he did not want them to develop too much of a sense of autonomy that would ultimately thwart or impede his control over them. And so, this does not mean, though, that all enslavers believed in this idea. There were others who were afraid of offering enslaved people any leeway economically. But there were groups of Southern planters who were not only supportive, but also very public about their support of the slaves' economy, even resorting to actually writing down and accounting for the transactions between themselves and their slaves. One South Carolina enslaver described how this was done. In June 1837, South Carolina planter Charles C. Pinckney, who was a nephew and namesake of South Carolina Constitutional Convention delegate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, penned a letter to the Southern agriculturist in which he called attention to a subject that he believed lawmakers had failed to properly regulate. And that subject was the trade between bond and free. That's what the title was called. Pinckney argued that the laws designed to regulate trade between enslaved people and whites had completely failed to be effective. He wrote that neither lawmakers nor the laws that they created could curtail such exchanges when the parties involved, namely enslaved people and the whites with whom they were trading, had a vested interest in ignoring the law. So he proposed a solution to prevent what he believed were the dangers posed by trade between whites and enslaved people. He proposed that enslavers put themselves in the buyer's place. He believed that enslavers should purchase slaves' goods at full market price to drive the illicit trader from the neighborhood. That's what he wrote. Pinckney also advised fellow slaveholders to officially track the goods transacted between themselves and their slaves, which meant that he decided to officially integrate the slaves' trade more fully in his plantation's profit-making ventures. And he suggested other enslavers do so as well. And he argued this. Let's go back here. Good, okay. He wrote, much facility in this business arises from keeping a regular book of entries, which is an accounting record. And he suggested this can be done by every planter who understands his factor's accounts. And a factor was kind of a middleman, a person who would negotiate the price of cotton, for example. Pinckney noted by carefully entering notes and amounts, by carefully entering dates and amounts, the time thus employed does not much affect the interests or comforts of the planter, whilst it materially promotes those of the slave. Some enslavers put this type of accounting practice in what they physically called Negro account books. He urged planters to follow his example and more closely track their trade with slaves to protect their own economic interests and really to protect their own economic investments in slavery. But although Pinckney writes in a way that suggests he was looking out for his slaves, we can take another perspective, that he was doing so to protect his own economic interests. His ideas reflected an accepted way of enslavers approaching their investments in slavery, and by extension, their investments in the slaves' economy. Pinckney's approach was an example of how enslavers began incorporating principles that we typically associate with capitalist enterprise into their economic strategies to profit from slavery and slaveholding. And so as enslaved people weathered the violence that characterized slavery in antebellum South Carolina through clinging to their networks of exchange and commerce, enslavers were integrating accounting as a tool in their economic arsenal. They attempted to approach their plantation enterprises and modulate their ideas about slaveholding mastery, not as paternalists who cared about the well-being of their slaves, but as business people and perhaps even as entrepreneurs. Enslavers implemented a new framework of coercion as they created strategies to make their capital investments in slavery and slaveholding as profitable as possible. These innovations incorporated accounting, actually writing down and tracking their trade with enslaved people. But not all enslavers adopted accounting as a practice of control. Others simply traded with enslaved people informally and illegally. So let's go to the next slide here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we're good. So the experiences of an enslaved man named John Andrew Jackson serves as an example. According to Jackson, who published his narrative in 1862 after a daring escape to freedom in 1846, slavery had evolved into an institution where enslavers were unabashedly looking for new ways to extract as much labor from enslaved people as possible. Jackson described how one of his enslavers profited by illicitly trading with enslaved men and women. And according to Jackson, his enslaver established a plantation store, and he sold liquor to whites during the day, and to supplement his income traded with enslaved laborers at night. And this is what Jackson revealed. He told the slaves roundabout to steal cotton and bring it to him, and he would give them whiskey for it. But if their masters caught them, they were to say that they were not bringing it to him. The consequence was that some slaves brought 100 pounds of cotton to him, for which he gave them 1 gallon of whiskey. So 100 pounds of cotton for 1 gallon of whiskey. The 100 weight of cotton was worth $14. So 100 pounds of cotton at this time was worth approximately $100, according to Jackson. And the gallon of whiskey was worth $1. But the slaves did not know this. And so they were cheated. Others who brought a half hundredweight received a half gallon, and so on. This he continued for a long time, until for fear of being betrayed, he put a stop to it. And this is the important part of Jackson's revelation. He says this method of getting rich is very common among the slaveholders of South Carolina. And so Jackson's revelation about one South Carolina community's illicit trading networks really shows us how enslaved people's investment in the exchange of goods actually revolved around enslavers' exploitation of their interests in economic activities. And in the end, the enslavers became rich. They enriched themselves by hoarding slave-grown cotton, swindling the enslaved in the process. Now, considering the perspective of both a runaway slave and an enslaver, it becomes clear that slaveholder profit dictated enslaved people's economic lives, especially in the antebellum period. But some enslavers, such as Charles Pinckney, were not upfront about their concerns about the profitability of slavery. And it was not uncommon for enslavers to cover their capitalistic practices in the language of benevolence, especially benevolent mastery. Many enslavers, especially in the antebellum period, emphasized their efforts to prevent temptation and mischief among the enslaved as a reason for encouraging, or in reality coercing, enslaved people to spend their free time engaged in economically productive pursuits. Yet some enslavers struggled with articulating their ideas about the slave's economy, because when they did, they often related slaves' industriousness and self-serving activities as a benefit, ultimately, to the enslaver. And this logic revolved around enslaver profits, again, through slave productivity. And it is also worth mentioning that some enslavers were actually writing and circulating ideas about slave management, saying that by encouraging their enslaved laborers to be economically productive, to engage in waged work, that it kept them from running away. So, here we'll go to the next slide. An example of this rationale can be found in an 1852 speech before the Darlington Agricultural Association, given by enslaver Thomas Law, whose account book you are looking at now. So in the speech, Law argued that, quote unquote, strict discipline and work in moderation would keep enslaved laborers productive. And he said that he encouraged his slaves to have a small crop, and he would always purchase what his slaves had to sell because he believed that such practices, really such management practices, kept them happy and safe. But above all else, he argued that purchasing his slaves' crop would keep them productive. And let's not forget that in this equation, slave productivity equaled profitability. This small glimpse into Law's Negro book, as it's called, is revealing. On the left side, you have the purchasing records of an enslaved woman named Lucy. Lucy, presumably in 1859, because of the dates on the corresponding pages, bought from Law a variety of goods, such as cheese, homespun, which is cloth, and handkerchiefs for a total of $3.63. She, in exchange, sold him 304 pounds of cotton, and for this large amount, over a half bale of cotton, she was paid $9.12. At this point, a bale of cotton was about 500 pounds. So the average, this means that Lucy received about less than 3 cents a pound of cotton, per pound of cotton from Law. That's the rate at which the exchange went. Now, the average price of cotton in 1860 out of Charleston was about 10 cents a pound. So while she earned $9.12, Law could sell the same poundage of cotton and make $30. He made over $20 profit from compelling Lucy to harvest extra cotton. And so it's important to note that Lucy sold Law 304 pounds of cotton. This was in excess of her quota that she was supposed to cultivate and harvest over a specific period of time. So this record is an example of a shift that was occurring in the economics of slavery and really the practice of slaveholding that began in the 1820s and continued into the Civil War. This shift was again accounting as an aspect of the capitalist evolution of slavery in South Carolina and the United States writ large. All of this is to say that the economic activities of enslaved people became a part of enslavers' economic investments in slavery and in the profits of cotton cultivation. So in addition to violence, enslavers used the slaves economy to compel enslaved people to be more productive. They began controlling slaves' economic activities to really profit off of slaves' interests in making money and buying goods for themselves. Indeed, they increasingly made slaves responsible for feeding and clothing themselves. So the fact that enslaved people had the opportunity to earn and save money, to possess property, and to act as consumers does not mean that their lives were made much better. Put another way, for enslaved people, their investments in the foundations of capitalism did not always offer positive benefits. Yes, they may have had access to a wide variety of goods. And yes, they may have been able to make their lives better materially through purchasing and acquiring items such as clothing or shoes, or even food or liquor. But what does the ability to acquire goods, what does the ability to be a consumer mean when enslaved people remained enslaved? And so when formerly enslaved man, Ezra Adams of Columbia, South Carolina, was interviewed about his experience as an enslaved boy in 1936. He offered unadulterated remarks about the Civil War, about slavery, and about the challenges of freedom. Free people, he recalled, found out that freedom ain't nothing unless you got something to live on and a place to call home. And so according to Adams, who was in his early 80s at the time, African Americans in 1936 were still living with the everyday vestiges of slavery. Despite the ratification of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, which ended legal slavery, extended American citizenship to African Americans, and gave Black men the right to vote, African Americans such as Adams remained skeptical about the privileges of legal freedom. He quipped, "This living on liberty is like young folks living on love after they get married. It just don't work." So ultimately, the connections between capitalism and freedom have always been tenuous for African Americans. Wages and money alone were not going to solve the social, legal, and economic hurdles that African Americans faced. It is in this way that the remnants of slavery linger long after the institution's end. Even though the formerly enslaved brought with them concrete knowledge about how to engage as actors in America's capitalist economy, they had to fight for what they rightfully belonged to them. This is because they entered the period after the Civil War, they entered Reconstruction with citizenship, yes, but with no capital and no wealth. And despite their eagerness to live with full citizenship, a citizenship that they continued to fight legal battles over, with the hopes of taking advantage of all that American citizenship had to offer, their economic prospects continued to be grim. So all of this is to say that I'm really encouraging us to rethink the relationship and understand the relationship between capitalism and freedom. And this hopefully will encourage us to rethink the relationship between capitalism, freedom, race, and the persistent wealth gap. Instead, if we look at the experiences of enslaved people, then we get a very different message about how much our investment in capitalism will free us from the vestiges of slavery in American society. Moreover, to fully understand why the intersection of racism and capitalism, especially around the racial wealth gap, continues to emerge in our conversations about economic inequality, we need to fully understand how the relationship between capitalism and slavery emerged in the United States. And importantly, we have to gain a fuller understanding about how it played out in the economic lives of enslaved people. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. That was great. That was, yeah, a little applause here. We are now joined by our great band of discussants who will introduce themselves. And I think I'm kicking it to Ryan, correct?
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, for that. And I'm Ryan Gibson. I'm a current postdoctoral scholar of diversity and innovation here at UNH in the Department of Sociology. And I am so happy to be here with you, Justine. Congratulations on the publication of the book. And it really is amazing. You really zoom in on these incredible stories to tell a larger macro story. And I think that that's amazing. One of my favorite things throughout reading the book is the different ways that you use economic terms, like the slave economy built into capitalist enterprises, or the capitalism that was sort of describing what's going on. I was wondering if you could, for us, conceptualize capitalism in a way that makes sense for you in this book. And if you could tell us a little bit about what informs that idea, or what thinkers or what lines of thinking informed your ideas of capitalism as you approach the project.
That is a great question. Thank you, Ryan. And that is actually a question I've thought quite a bit about. So in my mind, when I think about capitalism, especially the American form of capitalism, we are talking about the protection of private property, the protection of economic activity by some type of a governmental authority. And so in this way, we are seeing enslaved people kind of being forced into acting as economic actors. And so in a way, one of the aspects of the book that I find that I was really fascinated to interrogate was how there were entire legal structures that actually supported enslaved people engaging in trade. And so in the first chapter of the book in particular, I talk about kind of the legal history of kind of legal mechanisms to control the slaves economy. And so South Carolina was founded as a slaveholding colony in 1670. And interestingly, the first law, the first statute that colonial administrators create to not just recognize, but attempt to regulate slaves trading was in 1686. And so 16 years after the colony was founded. And it essentially says that colonial administrators have noticed that slaves were trading with white indentured servants, with white colonists, with Native Americans, and that this activity was deemed to be illegal. But there was a loophole. It was legal if the enslaved person had an enslaver's permission. And so I see this statute as being transformative. It not only recognizes the economic activities of the enslaved, but it makes enslavers essentially responsible for this economic activity. And essentially, there were many enslavers who not only encouraged, but promoted enslaved activity. There are moments, especially in the first chapter, where enslavers are advertising their slaves, saying that this person is a great market woman, or this person kind of carries goods to the marketplace and is a good negotiator. And that just kind of blew my mind. I'm thinking, okay, well, if we continue to think that these activities are supposedly illicit, and we have those with both political and economic power in this colony actually not just recognizing, but supporting and making money off of the acumen of enslaved laborers, especially enslaved women, then it tells us a lot about the role of the enslaved economy within the culture of slavery in South Carolina, and how it is so embedded in kind of the really important economic developments that occur in South Carolina, especially into the early Republican period, with the kind of massive growth of cotton and the major investments that enslavers and planters were making within this larger economy of slavery.
Thanks. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I think, Alexis, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. And thank you, Justine, for a wonderful talk and an incredible book. It was a joy to read. I wanted to follow up really on elements of Ryan's question and your answer. And I'm not surprised, of course, to hear that it's something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. But my specific question really is about this choice to use the word capitalist to describe the activities of enslaved people. Enslaved people, as you demonstrate with very evocative examples from the archives, and many of which you touched on in your talk today, enslaved people were actively engaged in and participating in the market economy. Mm-hmm. But again, we generally talk about capitalists as people who are extracting profit from the labor of others. So are enslaved people more like wage laborers and or consumers or small holders? You show them occupying each of those economic positions at different times, but I would think that one can occupy any and all of those positions and still not be a capitalist. So what is at stake for you in identifying enslaved people as capitalists rather than simply being forced by their enslavers and the conditions of their enslavement to participate in emergent capitalist markets?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. And it's again, one that I've thought quite a bit about, especially in terms of whether I was willing to make that leap of saying that at times slaves were capitalists. And I think that well, first of all, I think this comes down to a definition, certainly. And other historians, in particular, Seth Rockman, has kind of encouraged us historians, especially of this period, to kind of more embrace it as a way to kind of recognize the types of economic activity that we see in our sources. But I think what we also have to do is kind of detangle this understanding that I think we tend to have to say that all capitalists have power. And I don't think that's the case, right? We live in a capitalist society now. And are there moments in which we are actively extracting labor from other people? I'm not sure if that's true, but we are still kind of engaged in this activity necessarily because we are living and functioning within a society that relies on this idea of capitalism. And we've kind of in a de facto way bought into it. And so I see enslaved laborers is kind of operating in a similar way. They are being kind of coerced and forced and nudged and oftentimes pushed into acting as economic actors in a capitalist way. And I see this especially in the 1820s and 1830s, as enslavers are starting to actually account for their trade with slaves. And so in a way, the slaves economy before this period, before the 1820s and 30s, was kind of more this visible, but not as much of this concrete kind of thing, right? This concrete economy. But I think once enslavers and once merchants and once factors start to engage with the enslaved economically, I think it shifts their position within this burgeoning capitalist economy in really interesting ways. It pushes them to kind of occupy a different type of space now that their economic activities, what was seen as informal, is becoming wrapped up into a kind of a more formalized economic environment. And so I see accounting as a way in which they are being forcibly shifted in that really important way.
Thanks. That's really helpful clarifications. I think that Casey has another follow-up, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Ryan. For people in the room, I guess we're introducing Alexis Broderick.
Oh yeah, I thank you, Casey. I forgot that I was supposed to introduce myself. I'm Alexis Broderick and an assistant professor in the history department here. I was so enthralled with the discussion about capitalism, I simply forgot.
It possesses us, yeah, for better or for worse. Hint, it's for worse. So, hi everybody, I'm Casey Galamski. I'm an assistant professor, or associate professor, get that right, of anthropology and women's studies. I'm the program chair of our small but mighty minor in Africana and African American studies program too at UNH. So thank you for attending. And yeah, I think there's so much that can be discussed in your book, Justine. It was really wonderful. And yeah, I think like some of my comments or question can move organically from this notion of yeah, were they capitalists or not? I think the archival sources you found are really giving us nice, richer biographies of these individuals that maybe that haven't been told before. And so I really appreciated that you're revealing the multiple roles that these people could have or could play in these in the communities that they lived in. I think kind of like we've moved in our terminology from calling people slaves to calling them enslaved persons to recognize their humanity. Mm-hmm. You're showing their multidimensionality as, you know, part of family systems, as economic agents, albeit constrained. And there's something very powerful in that historiographically, ethnographically. So I appreciated that. And I wanted to maybe know a little bit more, if it was possible in your research, you know, about these folks. I was really, I guess, I'm trying to think of like what can I go off of here, because I have lots of different questions that we do have a lot of time. So these folks who went to market, how did they get there? Were they kind of like portering for their slave holders? Like when the slave holders went to market, were they possibly also acting as envoys or messengers for other enslaved people working in the market to, you know, transact in news about potential subterfuge, the kind of relationships among women in the marketplace. And I think this is also kind of leading me to a really wonderful aspect of your book, which was at certain times revealing that people had what you called exuberance in their lives, moments that enslaved people perhaps felt camaraderie or fellowship. And so if you can maybe elaborate on some of the aspects of these people's subjectivities at all, we can read that in the historical record. I'd appreciate that.
No, great question. Thank you so much, Casey. All right, so I'll take the second part first. So yeah, in an interesting way, a lot of especially enslaved women used their roles and positions within the kind of physical public marketplace as a space to not just exert power, but to really fellowship with one another. It was a way of exchanging not just goods, but also information. Well, I guess information is a good in many ways, right? It's a commodity as well. But yeah, and so they used their economic activities to form communities with one another, especially among enslaved women. And so it's an interesting way to kind of think about not just how the enslaved use economic activity and the kind of networks of exchange that they created as a shield against the violence and traumas of being enslaved. But they did so because it was a major outlet through which they could wield a certain amount of power and autonomy. But interestingly enough, kind of in that vein, the physical kind of trek to the marketplace, especially in a place like Charleston from outlying plantations, required a certain amount of kind of dexterity and skill. And there was, again, an entire economy around transportation. Mm-hmm. And so the South Carolina Low Country is surrounded by kind of rivers and tributaries. And so there were enslaved men in particular who made and used canoes. And they would charge whoever wanted to kind of get to a certain place to be transported there. And so it was not uncommon for enslaved women in particular to use these types of routes, to use the riverways to travel to Charleston, for example, to the lower marketplace. Mm-hmm. But it was oftentimes a trek. It would take, many times on Sundays, it would take a while to kind of get there. And so they would leave before daybreak and get there in the morning, and then trek back once they had sold all of their goods and their wares. And so it was an additional amount of labor that they put into not only cultivating food and raising livestock, they made baskets, they made sweets, interestingly enough. And so when we talk about work and when we talk about waged work, it was work. It was physically laborious, especially in the summertime. I'm not sure if anyone's been to South Carolina in the summer, but it is a time. It is hot and humid. And there were, lines of enslaved women trekking from outlying plantations to the marketplace. And so this was work. This was additional labor that they were willingly putting in order to fellowship with one another or to just earn money for themselves and their families. Yeah, and so I will address the fact that I do tend to take a more pessimistic view of these economies that the enslaved created. And one of the reasons why is because within the literature, I found that although the work of many historians really led me to this place of being excited about learning about the economic lives of enslaved people, in many ways I kind of felt as though it was really positive, which kind of led me to ask, well, if they were engaging in these types of activities, was the only goal to participate as consumers? Was their only goal to kind of buy goods, or did they want more? Oftentimes they wanted more. They wanted the experience of buying their own freedom or the freedom of their families, but that happened in so few instances that I started thinking more about, well, what was the real benefit of these activities? Yes, they gained a psychic boost from making money, from earning wages, but with the exception of a few exceptional people who I talk about in the book, most of the enslaved were just kind of engaging in extra work, engaging in waged work, engaging in trade, just to buy an extra pair of shoes or to buy a hat to protect themselves from the sun, or to buy whiskey or rum for a variety of reasons, right? To dull the violence and trauma of slavery. So, and to me, that was directly kind of involved in this larger project of kind of slavery's capitalism, especially as enslavers saw it increasingly in the antebellum period.
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization. Like, we need to see how the broader system in which they're enveloped is framing the kind of experiential dimensions that we might pick out from, like, a painting of people smiling, or, a lot of the commentary on the market women was, kind of gruesome and, racist, of course, but then, it's like we have to trying to read experience from
Sure. And I mean, I think it is worth saying, kind of getting more to this question of confronting the racial wealth gap and really economic and racial inequality in America today. I think that there is this narrative. It's a very American narrative that connects kind of success within a capitalist marketplace to freedom. But I think if we look at the history of the emergence of capitalism and capitalist enterprise in what would become the United States, if we look then at the history of its connection to slavery, then I think we can get a very different perspective and understanding about the interconnected ways in which slavery and capitalism kind of evolved in tandem in the United States. And to kind of taking a step back from a more theoretical standpoint, I think we often think that capitalism means freedom, like investing in capitalist enterprise means that one is more free, especially within a democracy. But I think if we look not just at the experience of the enslaved, but if we see what happened to the formerly enslaved during Reconstruction, then a very different story emerges about who has power, who has economic and political power, and who can kind of wield that to their advantage. And so kind of tracking back this history, I see this as being so important to understanding why we are continuing to have these conversations about the racial wealth gap and racial and economic inequality today.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I see that we have a comment from Lige Gould, which I will read. And I have a lot of questions about, let me read Lige's question, and then we'll see if we have time for what my addition would be. So he writes that this is more of a comment than a question, but picking up on the question I had asked before, it would be interesting to compare rates of capital accumulation and upward mobility between members of the Victorian English working class and enslaved, and then post 1865 formerly enslaved Black people. So if capitalism is the problem, you would expect them to be comparable. If they experience different rates, it would suggest factors other than capitalism were at work.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I don't know if
that might be really interesting. I mean, especially in the 1870s and really to the end of the 19th century, I do wonder that as well. You're proposing another project for me, so thank you.
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, Michael, did you have a comment that you wanted to bring in? Because I know that you're on mute right now, but I think that you want to sort of bring it to the present.
Well, is that what I wanted to do?
I don't know, maybe.
Well, it's actually, I've been fulminating since Alexis's question, which, I don't know whether they were capitalists or not, but they were definitely enterprising and entrepreneurial, which really like jumped out at me. And one of the things that struck me was that they were enterprising and entrepreneurial, but so you had a white population, certainly the enslavers, who were being enterprising and entrepreneurial. And, if we're talking about a gap, and to some extent, you bring into this an economic history of South Carolina during the period, kind of inevitably. And so, the enslavers and other people in the white population were like making economic progress. And sort of with the tiny little windows of opportunity, under obviously oppressive circumstances, the enslaved population was sort of being entrepreneurial and enterprising, but with huge limitations on what they could do.
Sure.
And the limitations ebbed and flowed to some extent, which I think is a really interesting part of the book. But the gap, I imagine, was like getting bigger during all of that period, right? As you know, the cotton economy was taking up and the enslavers were capturing most of the benefits of that, you know, but then like extending it post, slavery ends, right? But you still have like the limitations are less on the Black population, but you don't have any limitation. I mean, you don't have brakes on sort of the progress of the white population. So even if you release, you take off the slavery limitation, you still have limitations. So the gap just keeps getting bigger. And so I'm just like, that popped into my head as a way of visualizing kind of your point about, kind of how it continues even post-slavery. So I just sort of like, do you think that makes sense? Or I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
No, I think it does make sense, and that's why in the next project I'm venturing into thinking about how this plays out during the period of Reconstruction, and in particular thinking about the history of the Freedmen's Bank, the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, as kind of a case study in how some of these ideas play out. But I think importantly, though, we often celebrate the end of slavery in 1865, but it's not as if the institutions and the regimes completely die off, right? The vestiges are still there. And then if we move into, of course, the 19th and the 20th centuries, we continue to see the ways in which the federal government in particular, but also financial institutions completely ignored or pushed out African-American laborers from taking full advantage of certain programs that would have benefited them economically. Redlining, of course, is one of those was one of those practices, but and kind of exclusionary tactics in terms of investments in banking. But I think that it is kind of interesting to think about, well, what takes its place when slavery legally ends? And that I think is a question that historians of Reconstruction in particular are revisiting, because I think it is such an important question in terms of understanding what happens when slavery ends. And there are some historians who believe that it never really ends, that there continue to be systems and institutions that mirrored slavery in many ways. I mean, the rise of convict leasing and vagrancy laws being kind of one of those institutions that took slavery's place. So yeah, I think that these questions are really important, and ones that are continuing to resonate with me as I think about the next project and how it connects to this one.
Wow. Yeah, you have a lot, it seems like, it's to work with what you started with. I guess, great, like you have a whole career ahead of you. This is the first of, I'm sure, hundreds of books you're going to write.
Oh gosh, why would you foist all that work onto me, Ryan?
So I'm going to ask you a related question. Obviously, all these questions are related, but one of the things I really loved about your book is you end not where you'd expect in terms of, like you said, optimistic or pessimistic. You end up quite pessimistic that their enslaved activities, the slave economy itself, actually just made them more a part of the overarching capitalist system, and ultimately worked in favor of the enslavers. The enslavers were fine with letting them have economic activity as long as they were in charge of it. And I wonder how much you see that paralleling to what's happening today. There's a lot of conversations, obviously, in political discourse about capitalism and what that means, and how we as economic actors play into it to our extent as parts of the system. And I saw that sort of reverberation. I wonder if your historical lens can inform sort of what's going on now in terms of how working within the system can sometimes make it stronger, and using the master's tools. Can you really use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? type of question. So
that's a great question. And again, I am increasingly pessimistic though.
no, please give us some
I mean, this fight for justice and equality in particular has been happening since the 17th century. And so not to say that we have not made great strides, but if you are talking about a federal government created and founded when people of African descent, when Native Americans were subjugated, I think that is a hard history to untether oneself from, or an entire nation from. And I think that we are still contending with that. And as I like to say to my students, systems work in the way that they are designed to work. And so in some way we shouldn't be surprised. Perhaps we should be surprised at the amount of progress that we've made. I don't know. But yeah, I think that there has to be a lot of change, and I wish I were more optimistic about the prospects of that.
No, that's what I love. You point out the micro stories that work as a part of this larger structural story, and you're like, well, ultimately, you're right. If the structure doesn't change, the system is what the system is. You can't expect a lot. So I think, based on your book and what you've done, you've laid out an argument, a lot of evidence, that it really works in a feedback loop that's not always positive. Someone want to pick up on that or ask a completely separate question? But thank you so much.
I was actually going to ask a completely separate question and just read the question we have from Mike Leese.
Yes.
So, because this is taking us in a way different place. So he asks, do we see any deals between enslavers and enslaved, like in the ancient Greek and Roman world, where there were loans of principal, peculium, from masters in exchange for profit-sharing schemes of the enslaved, or any enslaved business people who became renowned for their acumen, are rich from their successful activities in the market. And I had just read for the first time about this practice of this peculium in Katerina Pistor's new book, The Code of Capital. And so I was thinking about this too. And Mike, being, an expert in this area, I think has a lot of knowledge and experience about it. But yeah, do you know of any similar type of activity in the Slave South?
Oh, this is so interesting. I love talking about the peculium because it's an idea that I think is so fascinating, right? The idea that that the enslaved would work economically on behalf and make deals on behalf of the enslaver. And I think ancient Greek, ancient Rome, I think is a great example of one of the ways in which these that one can be an economic actor, but still be enslaved. Like these two things can coexist very nicely in a way. But interestingly enough, no, I had not found a lot of evidence of this. And I think it's because enslavers in South Carolina were still continually so afraid of their slaves and of the destructive potential of slaves. And so they were okay with slaves having a specific amount, a small amount of money, right? But never enough where they could purchase their freedom. And I do have a couple examples. I think the most prominent of which is in chapter 4, where I talk about Demarc Vesey, right? He wins a lottery. He wins $1,500, the modern equivalent of which was like $1.3 million. And so he won this massive lottery. And his enslaver actually not just allowed him to keep it, but allowed him to purchase his own freedom with it. And that was kind of extraordinary. But that tells me, though, that it was not uncommon. It was not common for the enslaved to be able to make or even save enough money to purchase their own freedom. And they were, insofar as they were kind of making deals and negotiating on their enslavers' behalf, we're talking about market women. And they were kind of negotiating with their enslavers to be able to keep a certain amount of money that they earned in excess of what they would have to pay their enslavers for the privilege of going to market. And so in many ways, and other historians have looked at this, most recently, Caitlin Rosenthal in Accounting for Slavery. She talks about how increasingly Atlantic slavery, both in regions of the Caribbean and in the American South, were run like business enterprises. There were management practices that we would see mirror management practices today. And I think that that is a really important way to understand this type of economic relationship. Enslavers were very much invested in slavery, despite what they were writing about being paternalists and caring about their slaves and being the paternalists over the family, Black and white. No, they were in it to win it. They were investing in slavery because they wanted to profit from it. And so yeah, there were very, very, very few instances. I can think of just a handful where you see enslavers kind of dealing with slaves in that way.
Great, thanks.
Can I jump in? I had just kind of something you said just reminded me of this thing I was thinking of when I was reading the book, which was I find it interesting that the parts where you're describing kind of the tensions between the white enslavers and the rest of the white population, and just the other white population was, you know, objected to a lot of this entrepreneurial activity because they felt like it threatened them economically. And it sort of, I had like it echoed to me to current day, where you sort of have white working, you know, not everybody, but you have resentment against immigrants who are extremely weak, you know, in a very weak position in the economy. And you sort of have the capitalist class sort of siding with the immigrants, ostensibly for benevolent reasons sometimes. And sort of it sort of remind, like that triangulation I echoed when I was reading about that part. So I think anyway, if you could talk about that part of it, I thought it was very interesting.
No, I'm glad that you picked up on that, because that is exactly what I was thinking about when I was reading these records and writing about it. Just saying, why is this kind of this seems to mirror some of the kind of nativist beliefs among the white working class that just keep on emerging throughout moments in American history. And in the story that I'm telling, it's directed towards especially skilled slaves. Especially skilled slaves, in particular after the revolution, right? There's this moment where there's this kind of white populace that is excited about liberty and about freedom, but then you have working class whites who are essentially competing with skilled Blacks for jobs. And they are writing to the General Assembly saying, please do something about this. Please kind of help protect our economic interests. We have to compete not just amongst one another, but with skilled slaves who, of course, aren't going to charge as much as we are. And where's the profit going? To their enslavers. And then you see politicians who are often enslavers themselves or have economic interests that are directly aligned with enslavers, who are saying, well, this really isn't a problem because, you know, there's enough employment to go around, and really we have to protect the property rights of the enslaved. And so protecting the of enslavers. And so protecting the property rights of enslavers becomes so important in this period that I contend, especially in chapter 6, that it perhaps it could have the potential, or it could have had the potential to undermine white support of secession in 1860, because you do have members of the burgeoning white laboring classes saying, well, why are we going to align ourselves with enslavers when they have not kind of protected our economic interests, especially in relationship to skilled slaves? So I think it is a really interesting story. In many ways, it is a very American story because it keeps popping up at discrete moments in American history.
Yeah, I agree. I think this kind of relates to a question that I was forming in reading the book the past couple of days, and which I think you kind of like helped us see. You mentioned that South Carolina was a colony in 1670, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then the first law to kind of regulate this activity was 1686. Did you say?
Yep.
Yeah. You know, and it's reminding me of this kind of tension between local economic activity, kind of like grassroots, like local community, versus what like the state is kind of proclaiming, right? Like the power that be. And this question is kind of boiling down to the notion of custom and customary, which popped up a lot in the book. Customary rights to sell their own goods. Customary rights vis-a-vis the task system, customary rights to seek hire with a slaveholder's permission. And, you know, I'm thinking of this like relationship between like, or the question of like, what is customary and what is not? Like, is customary what these kind of organic relationships are between 1670 and 1686, and then it like what is custom, what we've been doing to get by, however unequal, suddenly becomes like formally like illicit, right? So I guess if you could comment on, you know, formality, informality, customary before law, yeah, something like that.
No, it's a great question. And one of the goals of this project too was really to understand the legal history, more about the legal history of slavery, especially around the slaves economy. And I was expecting to find all of these laws and all this pushback against slaves trading. And while that is the case, there are colonial administrators in the colonial period, and then members of the General Assembly, in addition to kind of local administrators, are constantly talking about slaves trading and making money. They're constantly, interestingly enough, revising laws, especially after massive slavery revolts. And so there were two major moments when these laws are revised. The first is in 1740 after the Stono Rebellion, and the second is in 1822 after the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy. And so, but interestingly, after both of these moments, nothing really happens except for you have white colonists and then white citizens saying like, you continue to say that you uphold these laws, but nothing's being done. And I think that is because of the ways in which the slaves economy became so embedded within the culture of slavery. And so this idea of customary rights versus law means that the enslaved economy was accepted by members of these slave holding communities, both white and black, enslaved and free. And because they were accepted, and because many of these kind of incidences of slaves trading went not to state courts, but to local courts, you have justices of the peace kind of adjudicating these cases, and they're kind of holding the enslaved person accountable or not, and saying, this is fine. They had enslavers' permission. And so there becomes this idea that it is hard to legally control the slaves economy because you have groups of whites who are completely fine with it. You have poor whites who are trading with slaves because they get access to cheap goods, to cheap food. You have working class whites who are hiring slaves in addition to kind of pushing back against the prevalence of slave hiring. And then you have enslavers, and in particular, you have merchants who are fine with trading with slaves because they're making money. And so you have all of these kind of members of these communities who are fine with the slaves trade and slaves creating their own markets of exchange, that it kind of gains a certain type of customary right, that the enslaved gain these types of customary privileges because of the ways in which these types of activities were accepted by all members within their communities.
there seems to be like, custom kind of boils down to this mutual dependency, albeit hierarchical and like a violent dependency. And then law steps in to kind of render that like asunder, but you can't push back because it's a matter of like, survival again on like unequal terms. But
Sure.
fascinating.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it looks like we have time for maybe one more question or comment. Alexis, Michael, Casey. And if not, I've got plenty, because there's so much to talk about with this book. I still have 6 more questions, but I'll save them for an email after the talk.
Sounds good.
But does anyone have any final comments or questions for Justine while we have her?
I want to hear your question.
Oh, okay.
Make it good, Ryan.
Oh man, well, I'm not going to make it good. I'll have Justine make it good for me, because there was a part of the book. I love this quote, really stuck with me. And when we were talking about the relationship between the slave masters and the slave economy on page 172, you talk about how ultimately that dynamic never escapes violence. And the way you write it, I think, is just illustrative of so many ways you write in the book. But you write, in these instances, talking about the slave economy here, it was violence cloaked in a velvet glove of money and coercion. And I wonder, and I thought that was so eloquently put, a velvet glove of money and coercion. And I wonder again, sort of to what extent, pulling us into today, you definitely illustrate the change of a more brutal, violent, enforced capitalist structure to the coercive economic structure that developed, especially after cash cropping took off and the enslavers and capitals had way more money to do, the coercion, so to speak. And we've only seen that expand with multinational corporations, and we're seeing the wealth gap, and of course, the purpose of this lecture series, continue to grow. I guess my question for you is, what do you think, in terms of the structure of the way that the velvet glove of money and coercion is working today, is what is perpetuating? What would we need to change the dynamics so we no longer have coercive systems that separate, but cooperative systems? What do you think that's going to take? If you could send us out on a message of, if it had to take something to get us out of the velvet cloaked glove.
Oh, Ryan, that's such a great question. I know that to say I don't know is not satisfying. So I will speculate. How do we solve centuries of discrimination? Go.
Coercive to cooperative. Go.
I don't know. I mean, you could say getting more involved in politics at both the national and local level. It could be, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I could say that, especially for underserved, underfunded communities, investing capital in one's community is a way to kind of bring everyone up. But at the same time, that requires financial resources and capital.
Yeah.
And so perhaps reconceptualizing how we even think about capitalism is important, but practically, I don't know.
Yeah, because towards the end of the book too, you also talk about how property and capital are the essential building blocks of freedom. And so it feels like, so if wealth and freedom, because at different points in the book, it seems like they're, capitalism and freedom don't align at all. And yet, at the other hand, you conclude with property and capital are the means. You even brought the quote that found out that freedom ain't nothing unless you got something, right? So you need wealth to have that experience of freedom. And yet if that's coercively sort of denied, so I guess ultimately, I guess it would take exactly, I think you did answer the question. It's going to take more of that investment, and it's going to take more of getting the property and capital in the hands of those underserved communities. So
perhaps, yeah. And I mean, I do wonder, this is a broader conversation. I know we only have a minute left. I mean, increasingly interested in this, not just the idea, but the practicalities of reparation. It is not an unfounded.
That's where I was trying to sneak you.
No, I mean, it's not an unfounded idea. And to kind of level the gap, that is a question. Yeah, Darity and Mullen's book is really great on this. And they, for really practical ways, practical is in from a public policy standpoint, whether it's practical from a practical reason, a practical perspective is a different question, but I do think that at least is a step in the right direction to solve centuries of institutionalized discrimination. Is going to take a major overhaul and a major commitment. And there has to be the political will. And whether it's there is, I think, the bigger question. Because we can fund wars, but funding a policy to repair the centuries-long debt that is owed to the descendant of the enslaved, I think, is an important step in the right direction.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming today, gracing us with an hour and a half, much more than that actually, between technical rehearsals with your time. And again, congratulations, I think, from everyone here at UNH, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dr. Hill Edwards. Great stuff. Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Are we out?